So how new are you to Squarespace?
So this is my second week, so pretty
Amazing.
new, I would say, I guess.
All right. So you got it all figured out. So we're going to rewind a little bit and actually talk quite a bit about your career. But just to frame this for everyone in the community, the theme that we're examining Satu's career through is the importance of multiculturalism, multiple languages, multiple nations, and how embracing that can make you a stronger designer as an individual and make a company a stronger culture that better serves its employees and customers. So we're going to get to all that, but that's just to give you a sense of where we're headed. And the goal is to give you some specific tactics that you can think about as you go to your jobs tomorrow and think about ways that you can create an environment that's going to enable anyone to be extremely productive, happy, and produce great work. So with all that set up, let's just start by talking a little bit about you. So you went to university in Finland, and you were born and raised in Finland?
Yes.
So take us back. Was it Helsinki?
It was Helsinki,
All right,
yes.
take us back.
So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm originally from Finland, born and raised. I went to university back there. Did a stint in Barcelona for about a year, did studies there, and then an internship. And then after my graduation, got a job at a big media company back in Finland as a graphic designer, and that's kind of my background in graphic design. And then did a bunch of stints in different agencies as an art director. And about 5 years ago, I moved here to New York to work at a company called Stink Studios. I first started off as a senior art director in their team, and then later as a design director. And now, as of last week, I've been here at Squarespace as a design manager.
Amazing. So congratulations on all the progress, and welcome to Squarespace. One of the things we were talking about earlier was some of the influence that traveling around the world has had on your work process and your work itself. And you told me a story about how the time spent in Barcelona affected actually your design aesthetic. So I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, it's, Finland is part of Nordic countries where Scandinavian design is a big thing. And kind of growing up surrounded by that minimalism and modern design aesthetic kind of influenced me as a designer, of course. And then when I moved to Barcelona and kind of saw that rich and colorful culture, I realized how different it is from what I grew up in, and kind of how culture has a big impact on visual aesthetics as well, and design language. And that was kind of the aha moment for me when I was like, oh wow, this is something super interesting. And I kind of noticed it starting to affect my design as well.
And today, how do you decide when to bring out the moody, stark Finnish aesthetic versus the ebullient, vibrant Spanish aesthetic? Like, do you deploy those selectively?
I mean, that's a great question. I will always be a big fan of Scandinavian design. That's what I grew up with, and that's what I know. But I've definitely noticed an influence of living in Spain, that like injecting that color and that boldness that their culture has in my designs as well. And now living in New York, there's this beautiful roughness and grit that New York has, and I've noticed that influenced my design as well, and my kind of design aesthetic. So it kind of comes and goes and depends on the project that you work on, but there's definitely parts of those. It's not just black and white and gray anymore.
Awesome. Well, very good. So, and another thing you talked about was an experience you had coming to the United States for the first time. And you said that the act of presenting design work was very different here than it had been earlier in your career. I think what you said was actually you didn't really present work in Finland. And here, all of a sudden, you're being asked to get in front of a room and explain what the heck you did. So just paint those contrasts for us, because I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. In Finland, often it is the creative director or someone higher up who always presents the design work. So, excuse me, when I moved here, I was a senior art director and pretty high up on there. So I was obviously thrown into a bunch of bunch of meetings to present the work, and I realized that how different the culture is here, where I feel like earlier on you're kind of supported and kind of pushed to present your work and talk about your work, and of course that's something that comes naturally when you've done it a longer time, and for me that was one of the things that I just had to do and all over again to kind of be comfortable with it and really kind of.
So it was, even though you're like farther along your career, it was like a jarring moment to have to present your work for the first time?
It was definitely that. And Finnish people tend to be a bit like shy and kind of taken aback. So where Americans are more social and kind of talkative. So it was definitely like a big change in there. But you kind of get over it once you do it all over again. So it's something.
So you're not nervous when you walk into a review today?
A little bit.
How do you prepare yourself?
You know, just kind of going through your points, what you want to say, and I think that's something that we can all kind of relate to. Like presenting and talking in front of a lot of people is always nerve-wracking. So kind of just being ready to talk about what you want to present and knowing your work is a good kind of tip to get over that.
That's a good start.
That's a good start.
Well, cool. So just taking a little bit of a step back, and I think you may have already answered this in part, but this was a topic you feel deeply passionate about, and I'm curious if there was a moment in your career or your life that was really the spark that made you see the value of geez, I should not try to say that word. A moment that made you particularly passionate about the topic.
I mean, I was always super inspired by different cultures, and I was lucky enough to get to travel a lot when I was a kid. And actually, before becoming a designer, I really considered to be a history major because I was just so interested in different cultures. But I think a moment when it kind of hit me was when I moved to Barcelona and really kind of realized that everything visual there is so different from what it is back home in Finland. So that was kind of the moment for me. I was like, oh, this is really interesting how different cultures represent themselves visually.
Excellent. And we're going to talk in a couple of minutes about what to do to help things go right, but actually flipping that a little bit, I'm curious if there's been a moment where you felt like you were either a company you were working at or a coworker, was doing something that didn't make it easy for folks from other cultures to participate. Because I think sometimes we learn as much about the challenging situations as we do about the totally copacetic situations. So just curious if you have a story along those lines.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the biggest things is when you work in a multicultural environment is that you don't really realize that people might have different ways of communicating and expressing themselves. And I remember one of the first design reviews that I did here when I moved to New York, and the client didn't have as great ideas as I thought I did, and very Finnish bluntly way, I told them that, and I remember the faces of the producer in the room was terrified that I had expressed myself so bluntly and straightforward, and kind of after the meeting told me that, you can't say that in front of a client. You can't really express yourself that bluntly. And it was kind of one of those funny moments where you realize that there's a different way of doing things here than you do them back home, and it's just a matter of kind of understanding those differences and adapting yourself into those situations. And kind of now that I live and work here, I need to be more polite and use more niceties and
you're the first person to ever say they needed to be more polite in New York, so that
that's
makes
Finland
sound like a tough place. So another category, this is where we start getting into some nuggets that I think folks can think about in their own work. Suppose your company is opening up its service or starting to sell its product into a new geography, a new country. What do you recommend a company do to ready its employees to most effectively navigate local cultures? Like, what are some steps that everyone should take?
I mean, I think training is the most important thing. If you're launching a product somewhere that you don't really know the culture as well. You really need to train kind of your employees and like have that cultural understanding of where you're going to launch your product and really kind of make sure that it's appropriate for that culture and for the audience that you're making it. So kind of having some sort of training for people to really understand and doing research around the subject so you know what you're doing and where you're kind of going with your product.
And have you been through these types of trainings before?
I have a few times, back in Finland, surprisingly.
Okay. Very cool. What kind of stuff do they cover, out of curiosity?
It's just talking about, it's a lot about communication and how people express themselves differently in different cultures and what's okay to say and what are okay ways to act, you know, because in some cultures certain things are impolite and like shaking hands might be impolite somewhere where it's totally normal in the US. So it's things like that.
And if we had more time, I'd ask you to tell us what the Finnish trainer said about US norms, but that's for a different time. So thinking now of an organization and its employees internally, what are some of the best practices you see organizations follow to create a culture and workplace that's extremely conducive to a multicultural environment?
I mean, like I said before, training definitely helps people to kind of understand that. Another thing is if you do have a product that kind of is somewhere foreign, you need to like really consult that culture and like people to understand that. So I think training is the key kind of element to really help people navigate those waters.
And then, so suppose now we're in a scenario where we're working on a product, we're working on a design for a customer base that isn't necessarily represented in the room. What are some practices that you follow to make sure that you're representing the interests of that stakeholder, that community, that culture, even though they're not necessarily represented in the room?
I mean, that's definitely sometimes difficult to navigate when you don't always have every culture represented, but user testing is a great way to kind of make sure that you're doing it where your product is launched. And every time I've worked in a campaign, there's always been someone who's been consulted from that culture who really has a deep understanding of what's appropriate, what works for that place. So that's a good thing.
Amazing. And then I think one last question for me. So as you've done more and more work here over the past 5 years, most of us in the room, I think, are probably born and raised in the U.S. Many of us aren't also, which is fantastic. And one thing I love about this community. But I'm curious, are there one or two things that you think most born and raised people from the U.S. kind of take for granted? Either an assumption about users, an assumption about the way you communicate with people, other norms that you feel like you're constantly reminding us native folks, U.S. folks about?
I think one thing I've noticed once, like living abroad for over 5 years now, or actually longer, kind of noticing that how culture has an effect on your visual aesthetics. Like in Finland, how it's so embedded in our systems, how all the products and the milk cartons in store and the storefronts are all very minimal and modern. And then in the U.S., New York especially is a great example of the culture here in the U.S., where it's a melting pot of different cultures. And when you walk on the street, all the signs and storefronts are kind of a reflection of that. So it's kind of interesting that people don't really pay attention how much that culture has an effect on your design and your aesthetic.
And I guess actually this is truly the last question, but half tactical advice and half advertisement for Squarespace. So because this is something that's so important to you, you clearly thought about it in the interview process. You decided this was the right place for you. So what is it that Squarespace does specifically that made you feel like they contributed to creating an amazing environment for multicultural work?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. You're right about that. The kind of biggest thing that really stood out to me was that I was interviewed by people from different countries, from different culture, both men and women from different age groups, and that kind of solidified my idea that Squarespace really hires people who are the best at their job and really values diversity, which is amazing. And then, of course, the product itself is made to kind of empower people to do the best creative work that they possibly can, and that's definitely something that I can hop on board with.